"Don't bow your head," someone whispered once. But Elena Whitmore had learned long ago that survival in this hall meant silence, not defiance. And now the cold marble pressed through the thin fabric at her knees, sharp as winter frost, as the entire court watched her fall. The scent of polished stone and iron hung heavy in the air, mixed with expensive perfume and quiet cruelty. And above her, Victor Hale's voice cut clean and smooth, demanding obedience as if it were owed, as if she had ever belonged to him, as if replacing her with a brighter, louder Omega erased the years she had spent trying to be enough. Elena inhaled slowly, steady, her lungs tight but controlled, her fingers trembling just once before stilling against the ground, because she would not give them more than they had already taken, not her tears, not her voice, not the last piece of herself that still remembered dignity. Laughter rippled around her, soft at first, then growing, a tide of approval that made the walls feel closer, the torches hotter, the room smaller by the second, and somewhere to her right, Seraphine's heels clicked against the floor, deliberate, measured, claiming space that had once been Elena's. The new Omega's presence radiant and undeniable, drawing every eye except Elena's, because Elena did not look up, not at her, not at him, not at anyone. Instead, her gaze fixed forward, past the polished boots, past the shadows, landing on the throne that loomed at the far end of the hall, carved from ancient black stone, older than any alpha who dared sit upon it, older than the laws they pretended were unbreakable. Something about it felt different tonight, though she couldn't explain why, couldn't name the quiet pull in her chest, like a memory just out of reach, like a voice she almost recognized. Victor stepped closer, his presence heavy, his authority practiced, and when he spoke again, the command came softer, more dangerous, telling her to lower her head, to show respect. Properly this time, to understand her place. Elena's breath caught for half a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker, just long enough for the old instinct to obey to rise and press against her ribs, but then it passed, and in its place came something quieter, steadier, something that did not belong to fear. Her chin remained level, her spine straight despite the position she had been forced into, and the silence that followed stretched thin, fragile, as if the entire room was waiting for something to break. Beneath her palm, the stone felt colder than it should have been, almost alive in a way she couldn't understand, and as her fingers shifted slightly, a faint vibration traveled up her hand, subtle enough that no one else reacted, but strong enough to make her heart skip once. Sharp and unexpected. Elena didn't move, didn't react, but somewhere deep inside, something answered, something ancient and patient, as if it had been waiting far longer than she had ever known, and for the first time since her knees touched the ground, she felt it. This wasn't the end of her story, not here, not like this. The vibration did not stop, it spread slowly beneath Elena's palm like a pulse traveling through stone, steady and deliberate, and she felt it climb up her wrist into her arm, a quiet hum that did not belong to fear or humiliation, but to something older, something that did not care about Victor Hale or the whispers filling the hall. Her breathing shifted without her noticing, deeper now, slower, as if her body had recognized something her mind had not yet caught up to, and around her the laughter began to thin, not because anyone understood what was happening, but because something in the air had changed, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm when the wind stills and even the boldest voices hesitate. Victor's boot remained near her shoulder, not pressing now, just waiting, as if expecting her to break, to lower her head fully and complete the ritual of submission. But Elena did not move, and that stillness began to stretch into something uncomfortable for everyone watching. Seraphine shifted her weight, the soft rustle of silk echoing louder than it should have in the growing quiet. And when she spoke, her voice carried a thin edge that had not been there before, telling Elena to finish it, to stop pretending, to remember who she was now. But the words landed differently this time, like they were spoken into a room that was no longer listening. Elena's eyes lifted just slightly, not enough to meet anyone's gaze, just enough to see the base of the throne again, and the moment she focused on it, the sensation in her chest tightened, pulling her attention forward like a thread being drawn taut. And for a second she thought she heard something, not a voice exactly, but a presence, like a memory echoing through her bones. The torches along the walls flickered unevenly, their flames bending in a direction that did not match the still air, and a low murmur rippled through the crowd as a few of the older wolves exchanged uneasy glances, their instincts sharper, their experience telling them that something was off even if they could not name it. Victor exhaled sharply, impatience breaking through his polished composure, and he stepped around her, placing himself in her line of sight, forcing her to look at him if she raised her head any further. And when she did, finally, their eyes met, his filled with authority, expectation, and a trace of irritation, hers calm in a way that did not match the situation. A quiet steadiness that made something flicker behind his gaze for just a fraction of a second before he masked it. "You will show respect," he said, his voice lower now, controlled, carrying across the hall with practiced ease, and the crowd leaned in again, eager for the moment to resolve, for the balance they understood to restore itself. Elena's lips parted slightly, not to plead, not to apologize, but to breathe, and as she did the hum beneath her hand deepened, no longer subtle, no longer something she could ignore, and this time it moved beyond her, traveling outward across the floor in a wave so faint that it could have been imagined, except that the carved lines etched into the marble began to catch the torchlight differently, their patterns shifting as if something beneath them had awakened. A sharp intake of breath sounded from somewhere behind her, quickly stifled, and Elena felt it then, not just in her hand or her chest, but in the space around her. A pressure that did not push down but lifted, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Seraphine took a step back without meaning to, her confidence faltering just enough to show, and Victor noticed, his attention snapping briefly toward her before returning to Elena, his jaw tightening. "Enough," he said, and reached out, not roughly, but firmly, as if to guide her head down the last few inches. To end this, to reassert control. But the moment his hand moved through the air above her, the floor beneath Elena's palm answered. The vibration surged, stronger now, unmistakable, and a deep, resonant sound rolled through the hall, not loud but powerful, like stone shifting against stone somewhere far below, and every head turned toward the throne as a faint line of light traced along its base, thin as a crack at first, then widening just enough to be seen. Elena's heart pounded once, hard. But she did not pull away, did not flinch, because the sensation was not threatening. It was familiar in a way that made no sense, like something she had been born knowing but had forgotten until this exact moment. The crowd fell completely silent now, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by a tension so thick it pressed against every chest in the room, and even Victor's hand paused mid-motion, suspended between command and hesitation. Elena lifted her head fully then, not in defiance, not in challenge, but because something inside her told her to, and as she did, the faint glow along the throne's base pulsed once, in time with her heartbeat, and for the first time, she understood that whatever was waking beneath her was not reacting to him, or to Seraphine, or to the court watching with wide, uncertain eyes. It was responding to her. The moment the light pulsed in answer to her heartbeat, Elena felt it echo through her ribs, a second rhythm layered beneath her own, steady and ancient, and the realization did not come as a thought, but as a certainty settling deep in her bones, quiet and immovable. The throne was not reacting to the room, not to the Alpha who stood above her, not to the Omega who had replaced her. It was responding to her presence, to something in her that had never been seen, never been named, and for a brief second the weight she had carried for years shifted, just enough to let something else rise beneath it. Around her, the court remained frozen, the silence stretching into something fragile and electric, broken only by the faint, almost imperceptible sound of stone adjusting against stone, as if the foundation of the hall itself was listening. Victor's hand lowered slowly, not touching her now, his authority caught in the space between certainty and doubt, and his eyes searched her face for something familiar, something he could dismiss, but what he found instead was stillness, not submission, not defiance, but something he did not recognize, and that unsettled him more than any open resistance could have. Seraphine's confidence cracked further, her posture stiffening as she glanced toward the throne, then back to Victor, as if waiting for him to explain what none of them understood. But he did not speak, and that silence said more than words ever could. Elena drew in a breath, the air cooler now, sharper, carrying a faint metallic tang that had not been there before, and as she exhaled, her fingers pressed more firmly into the marble beneath her, not out of fear, but because the connection felt stronger, clearer, like a thread tightening between her and something far beyond the room. Images flickered at the edges of her mind, not fully formed, not memories exactly, but impressions, a vast hall much older than this one, a throne, untouched by time, a presence that did not bow to titles or power, but recognized something deeper, something intrinsic. She blinked once, grounding herself, but the feeling did not fade. It anchored instead, settling into her like it had always belonged there. A low murmur began at the edges of the crowd, quickly hushed, but not before it spread, because others were starting to feel it too, not the connection itself, but the shift in the air, the way the space seemed to center around her. Without her moving, as if the room had quietly reoriented itself, Victor straightened, drawing on the authority he had built over years, and when he spoke again his voice carried sharper now, edged with something that had not been there before, telling her to stand, to stop whatever this was, to remember her place. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow, like they no longer held the weight they once did. Elena heard him, but the command did not reach her the same way. It brushed past her. Instead, unable to settle, unable to take hold, and for the first time she understood that the rules she had lived under, the ones that had defined her worth, were not as absolute as she had believed. The faint glow along the throne's base brightened slightly, not enough to blind, just enough to be undeniable. Now, and a few of the elders took a step back without meaning to, their instincts recognizing something older than rank, older than hierarchy, something that did not answer to any alpha. Elena's gaze lifted again, this time fully, meeting the throne directly, and the moment her eyes aligned with it, the hum surged, filling her ears, her chest, the very air around her, and for a fraction of a second everything else faded, the voices, the tension, the presence of every person in the room reduced to distant shadows. In that space, she was not kneeling, she was not lesser, she simply was, and whatever lay beneath the stone recognized that truth without question. The sound came again, deeper this time, a resonant shift that traveled up through the floor and into the walls, and the throne responded, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a slow, deliberate movement that could not be mistaken for anything else. Its massive structure adjusting by inches, angling ever so slightly, not toward Victor, not toward the center of the hall where power was expected to rest, but toward her. A collective breath was drawn and held, the entire court caught between disbelief and realization, and Elena felt it then, not fear, not confusion, but clarity, sharp and undeniable, cutting through every doubt she had ever carried. She did not understand how. She did not understand why, but she knew this. With a certainty that settled into her like stone, whatever force governed this throne, whatever ancient law it obeyed, it had just made its choice, and for the first time in her life, Elena Whitmore was no longer the one being judged. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that could restore what had just shifted, and Elena felt the weight of that silence settle across the hall like a held breath that no one dared release. The throne did not return to its original position. It remained angled toward her, unmistakably, undeniably, and that single, quiet movement carried more authority than any command Victor had ever given, more certainty than any law the pack had ever enforced. Elena's knees were still against the marble, but the meaning of that position had changed, not in the eyes of tradition, not in the rules they had all memorized, but in something deeper that none of them could deny anymore. And as that realization spread, it moved through the room in waves, subtle at first, then growing stronger as more eyes shifted from Victor to her, from the standing alpha to the omega, who was no longer fitting into the shape they had assigned her. Victor noticed it. Of course he did. His instincts too sharp to miss the way attention drifted, the way uncertainty replaced obedience. And for a moment he stood very still, calculating, adjusting, searching for a way to regain control of a moment that was slipping through his fingers without any visible force pushing it away. Seraphine's composure fractured further, her earlier confidence replaced by something tight and brittle, her gaze darting between Victor and the throne, as if waiting for one of them to correct what had just happened, to dismiss it, to explain it away as illusion or coincidence, but neither moved to do so, and that absence of explanation made the moment heavier, not lighter. Elena shifted her weight slightly, the movement, small but deliberate, and for the first time since she had been forced down, she felt the ground beneath her not as something pressing against her, but as something holding her, steady and unwavering. And when she drew in another breath, it filled her chest fully, no longer constrained by the tightness that had followed her into this hall. The hum beneath her palms softened, not fading, but settling, like a presence that had made itself known and was now simply waiting, patient and assured. Victor took a step back, just one, subtle enough that someone might have missed it if they were not watching closely. But everyone was watching closely now, and that single step carried more meaning than any declaration could have, because it was the first time he had moved away from her instead of toward her. His voice came again, but it lacked the clean edge it had held before, not weak, but strained in a way that suggested effort, as if he was forcing authority back into words that no longer carried it naturally, telling her to stand, to end this display, to stop whatever trick she had managed to create. But even as he spoke, there was no conviction beneath it, no certainty that the command would be followed. Elena heard him, but she did not respond immediately, not out of defiance, but because the urgency that once drove her to obey had simply quieted, replaced by a stillness that allowed her to choose rather than react. And that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything. She lifted her hand from the marble slowly, her fingers trailing over the surface as if acknowledging the connection rather than breaking it. And when her palm left the stone, the faint glow along the throne dimmed slightly, but did not disappear. Lingering like an echo of what had just been revealed, Elena placed her hand against her own knee, grounding herself. And then, with measured control, she began to rise. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and every eye in the hall followed it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was no longer expected, no longer predictable. And that unpredictability carried a quiet power that filled the space between each second. As she stood, the room seemed to adjust around her, the lines of sight shifting, the balance of presence recalibrating in a way that no one could articulate, but everyone could feel. She did not look at Victor immediately, did not acknowledge Seraphine, did not seek approval or permission. Instead, her gaze returned to the throne one last time. And in that glance there was recognition, not of ownership, not of entitlement, but of something shared, something that had chosen her as much as she had unknowingly answered it. A faint murmur broke out again, quickly suppressed, but the tension had changed now, no longer sharp with mockery or expectation, but thick with uncertainty and something else, something closer to anticipation. Victor straightened fully, reclaiming his posture, but the space between him and Elena was no longer defined by dominance. It was defined by distance, by a shift that could not be undone simply by standing taller. Seraphine's voice came again, softer this time, almost careful, asking what this meant, but the question hung unanswered, not because no one could respond, but because the answer was already unfolding in front of them. Elena finally turned her head toward Victor, meeting his gaze not from below, not from the ground, but from equal height. And in that moment the silence returned, heavier than before, because this time it was not waiting for something to happen, it was acknowledging that something already had. Victor Hale had never been ignored in his own hall before, and the unfamiliar weight of it pressed against his chest as Elena Whitmore stood before him, no longer beneath, no longer contained within the place he had assigned her. And for the first time since she had entered this room, it was not her position that defined her, but her presence. He studied her carefully, searching for the flaw, the weakness, the explanation that would allow him to reclaim the moment, because men like him did not lose control. They corrected it, they reshaped it, they forced the world back into alignment, but nothing about what stood in front of him felt like something he could bend. Elena did not rush to speak, did not fill the silence that stretched between them, and that restraint made the tension sharper, more precise, like a blade that had not yet been drawn but was already understood. The court watched with a stillness that bordered on reverence, though none of them would have named it that. Not yet. But it was there in the way their eyes no longer skimmed past her, no longer dismissed her, but settled, focused, waiting. Seraphine shifted again, her composure now carefully reconstructed, but the effort showed in the tightness of her shoulders, in the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides, as if holding on to something that was slipping. She stepped forward, placing herself just behind Victor's shoulder, aligning with him, reinforcing the image of power that had existed moments ago. And when she spoke, her voice was smooth again, practiced, reminding the room that nothing had changed, that this was still a ceremony, still a declaration, still a moment of transition that had already been decided. But the words did not land the same way. They drifted instead, touching the edges of the room without settling, because everyone present had seen something they could not unsee. Elena felt it too. The shift in how sound moved, how attention held, how even the air seemed to pause before carrying each word forward, and beneath that awareness, the quiet presence that had awakened within her remained, steady and patient, no longer surging, no longer demanding attention, simply there, like a foundation she had never realized she stood upon. She drew in a slow breath, letting it ground her, letting it steady the last remnants of the fear that had once guided every movement she made. And when she exhaled, she finally spoke, her voice calm, not raised, not forced, but clear enough to carry across the hall without effort. And that alone caused a subtle ripple through the crowd, because they had never heard her speak like that before. She did not address Victor by title, did not lower her gaze, did not frame her words in apology or submission. Instead, she simply said that the throne had answered, and in those few words, she acknowledged what no one else had dared to name. Victor's jaw tightened, the smallest visible reaction, but enough, because it revealed that he understood exactly what she was implying, and more importantly, that he could not immediately deny it. The throne remained behind them, silent now, unmoving, but its earlier shift lingered in every mind, a fact that could not be argued away, not in a room where tradition was built on symbols older than any living wolf. One of the elders stepped forward then, slowly, as if approaching something sacred rather than political, his movements careful, deliberate, and when he reached a point just within the circle of open space, he stopped, his gaze moving from Elena to the throne and back again, his expression unreadable, but his posture changed, subtly, respectfully, and that change did not go unnoticed. The murmurs returned, softer this time, threaded with uncertainty and something else that had not been present before, something closer to recognition. Victor turned slightly, addressing the elder with controlled authority, asking if he had something to add, and though his voice was steady, there was an undercurrent beneath it, a tension that had not existed earlier, because now he was not just speaking to assert dominance, he was speaking to contain something that was expanding beyond him. The elder did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched long enough to make the entire hall lean into it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried, not because of volume, but because of the weight behind it, and he said that the throne did not move without reason, that it had not done so in generations, not in his lifetime, not in the lifetime of those who had come before him, and that such a response could not be ignored. The words settled heavily, not as a challenge, but as a statement of truth that no one present could dismiss without denying the very foundations of their order. Seraphine's composure faltered again, her eyes widening slightly before she forced them back into focus, her attention snapping to Victor as if waiting for him to counter, to dismiss, to command the room back into alignment. But the hesitation had already taken root. Elena stood still through it all, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, and for the first time, she was not reacting to the room was reacting to her. Victor looked at her again. Then, more closely this time, not as something beneath him, not as something to be corrected, but as something unknown, and in that look, there was calculation, yes, but also something else, something quieter, something that had not been there before. The first hint of recognition that whatever had just begun was not something he could simply end. The silence returned once more, but it was no longer fragile. It was full, grounded, and as Elena held his gaze without lowering hers, without stepping back, without asking for permission to exist in that space, It became clear to everyone watching that the balance of this room had shifted, not with a shout, not with a command, but with a single undeniable truth that had revealed itself in stone and silence alike, and nothing that followed would ever return it to what it had been. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the bones of the hall, as if the very structure had accepted what the people inside it were still struggling to understand. And Elena felt that acceptance before she saw it reflected in their eyes. A quiet shift that did not announce itself, but changed everything nonetheless. The elder's words lingered in the air, heavy and immovable, and no one rushed to challenge them. Not even Victor Hale, whose authority had always relied on swift certainty, on decisive control. Yet now he stood within a moment that refused to be rushed, that demanded recognition rather than command. Elena remained still, not because she did not know what to do, but because for the first time, she did not need to act to justify her place. It had already been acknowledged by something older than anyone in the room, something that did not answer to titles or alliances. Her gaze shifted once more toward the throne, and though it no longer moved, she could feel it, the same quiet presence that had answered her before, now steady and watchful, as if waiting for the others to catch up to what it had already decided. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but deliberate, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not weaker, but measured in a way it had not been before, as if each word was being chosen more carefully than usual, as if he understood that anything spoken too forcefully might shatter what little control he still held. He said that the throne's movement did not redefine the order of the pack, that tradition required more than a single moment, more than an unexplained shift, and while his words were structured, logical, even expected, they lacked the finality they once carried, and that absence did not go unnoticed. The court listened, but not with the same automatic agreement. Their attention divided now, their certainty fractured, because even as Victor spoke, their eyes continued to return to Elena, measuring, reassessing, questioning everything they had believed about her. Seraphine stepped forward again, closer this time, her posture aligned with Victor but her expression more guarded, and when she spoke, her voice held a softness that had not been present earlier, an attempt to smooth the tension, to bring the moment back into something familiar, suggesting that what they had witnessed could be interpreted, could be understood in a way that did not disrupt the established order. But even as she spoke, there was a hesitation beneath her tone, a recognition that her words were no longer shaping the room the way they had been moments ago. Elena listened to both of them, their voices moving through the space without settling on her, and she realized that the pressure she had always felt, the need to respond correctly, to lower herself, to align with expectations, was no longer there. It had not been taken from her. It had simply released its hold. She drew in a breath, slow and steady, and this time when she spoke, there was no hesitation at all, only clarity, and she said that she had not asked the throne to move, that she had not known it would, but it had answered anyway, and that fact did not require interpretation, it required acknowledgement. The words landed differently than anything said before, not louder, not sharper, but grounded in a way that made them difficult to dismiss, and a ripple moved through the elders, subtle but unified, their attention sharpening, their posture shifting just enough to signal that they were no longer observing as detached figures, but as witnesses to something that demanded response. Victor's gaze hardened slightly, not with anger, but with focus, and for a moment he said nothing, studying her as if trying to see beyond what was visible, to find the explanation that would return this to something he could control. But the longer he looked, the clearer it became that this was not something external to her, not a trick, not a coincidence, but something inherent, something that had simply been unseen until now. The hall remained still, every person present caught between what they had always known and what they were now being forced to consider, and in that space, Elena stood without shifting, without retreating, without claiming anything more than what had already been shown. And that restraint carried its own weight, because it left no room for argument, no opening for dismissal. One of the elders stepped forward again, closer this time, and though his movement was small, it drew attention, because it was the first time anyone had moved toward her instead of away from her or around her, and when he stopped, he inclined his head slightly, not deeply, not formally, but enough to be seen, enough to be understood as a gesture that had not been offered to her before. The effect of that single motion rippled outward, subtle but undeniable, and Elena felt it, not as validation, but as confirmation of what had already shifted. Victor saw it too, and something in his expression changed again, not breaking, not conceding, but adjusting, recalibrating in real time, because whatever this was, it was no longer something he could ignore or override with a command. Seraphine remained still now, her earlier attempts to guide the moment falling away, replaced by a quiet watchfulness that mirrored the rest of the court. And for the first time since she had stepped into this hall, she was not the center of attention, not the one shaping the narrative, but part of an audience witnessing something unfold beyond her influence. Elena stood in that space, grounded, steady, aware of every eye on her, and yet untouched by the weight of it, because the source of what had changed did not come from them. It came from something far older, something that had chosen her without asking permission. And as the silence settled once more, deeper and more certain than before, it became clear that whatever came next would not be decided by titles or declarations alone, but by whether those present were willing to accept what the throne had already revealed. The shift in the room did not reverse. It settled, deep and unyielding, like a truth that had already taken root beneath the surface, and Elena could feel it in the way the air no longer pressed against her, but seemed to move around her instead, adjusting, recalibrating, as if the hall itself was recognizing a new center. The elder who had inclined his head did not step back immediately, and that hesitation carried weight, because elders did not linger without purpose, and as his gaze remained on Elena, steady and thoughtful, it drew others into that same line of focus, one by one, until the attention of the court was no longer scattered, but aligned. Victor Hale noticed the pattern forming, the subtle realignment of loyalty, of instinct, of something deeper than conscious decision, and though his posture remained straight, composed, there was a tightening at the edge of his control, a tension that had not existed before this moment began. He moved then, not toward Elena, but slightly to the side, positioning himself between her and the throne, a quiet attempt to reclaim the visual center of the room, to place himself back into the line that mattered. But the effect was diminished, because the throne did not respond to his movement. It remained angled, unchanged, its silent acknowledgement fixed where it had already chosen. Seraphine's breath caught softly, almost inaudible, but Elena heard it, felt it. The shift from confidence to uncertainty now fully present, no longer hidden beneath practiced composure. And when Seraphine spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, not commanding, not even persuasive, but cautious, as if she were testing the ground beneath her words before placing weight on them. She suggested that perhaps the throne had reacted to something external, some ancient mechanism, some forgotten enchantment triggered by coincidence. But even as she spoke, the explanation sounded thin, fragile, unable to hold against the memory of what everyone had witnessed. Elena did not interrupt, did not challenge. She simply listened. And in that listening there was no urgency to correct or defend, because the truth did not require her to push it forward. It had already moved on its own. The hum within her remained, quiet but constant, no longer a surge but a presence, like a second awareness layered beneath her own, and with it came a growing clarity, not in the form of answers, but in the absence of doubt. She knew now that whatever this was, it was not new. It had not begun in this hall. It had only revealed itself here. Victor turned his attention fully back to her, his eyes sharper now, more focused, and when he spoke, his voice carried a deliberate calm, the kind that came from control reasserted through will rather than certainty. He said that power was not determined by a single moment, that leadership required recognition, structure, validation from those who governed. And though his words were carefully chosen, they were also a test, an attempt to reframe the situation into something he could define. The court listened, but their stillness had changed, no longer passive, no longer automatic, but attentive in a different way, weighing, considering, no longer accepting without question. Elena felt that shift as clearly as she had felt the movement of the throne, and it grounded her further, anchoring her in a space that no longer depended on his approval. She lifted her gaze to meet his again, steady and unflinching, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of meaning, full of everything that had changed without a single formal declaration. Then, slowly, Elena took a step forward, closing the distance that had once defined their positions, and though the movement was small, it carried through the room like a ripple, because it was not something she would have done before, not something anyone expected her to do now. She did not move past him, did not challenge his space. She simply stood, where she chose, no longer confined to the place he had forced her into. And that choice alone shifted the balance further. Behind him, the throne remained still, but the faintest trace of light flickered again along its base, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to draw the attention of those who were already watching too closely to miss it, and a quiet intake of breath moved through the elders once more. Victor felt it, even if he did not turn to look, and for the first time since this moment began, he did not immediately speak, because whatever he said next would not simply guide the room, it would define his place within what was unfolding, and that realization held him in stillness. Seraphine remained just behind him, her presence no longer dominant, no longer shaping the space, but part of the tension that filled it, and her silence now spoke louder than her earlier words. Elena stood in that center, not claiming authority, not demanding recognition, but embodying something that had already been acknowledged, something that did not require permission to exist. And as the seconds stretched, it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer a moment that could be contained within the rules they had always followed. It was something else, something that was still unfolding, and whether they accepted it or not, they were already standing inside it. The moment Elena stepped forward, the hall reacted before anyone consciously chose to. A subtle shift of weight, a quiet adjustment of posture, as if every instinct in the room was recalibrating around a center that had just moved, and she felt it in the way the air settled differently against her skin, no longer pressing inward, but opening, creating space where there had been none. Victor Hale did not step back this time, but he did not advance either, and that stillness between them became something tangible, a line neither of them crossed, not because it was forbidden, but because it had become unnecessary. His gaze held hers, searching, measuring, not for weakness now, but for truth, and what he found unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name, because there was no fear in her, no desperation, only a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission to exist. Behind him, the throne remained angled, its silent acknowledgement unchanged, and though it did not move again, its presence filled the space with a weight that no one could ignore, a reminder that something had already been decided beyond the reach of argument. The elders watched closely, their attention no longer divided, their instincts guiding them more than tradition now, and among them, a second elder stepped forward, slower than the first, his steps deliberate, his expression more severe, as if testing not just Elena, but the moment itself. He stopped several feet away, close enough to be part of the center, but not close enough to challenge it. And when he spoke, his voice carried the texture of years, steady and grounded, asking not what had happened, but what she felt when the throne moved, and the question shifted the room again, because it acknowledged her as the source rather than the subject. Elena did not rush to answer. She allowed the silence to hold for a breath, then another, and in that pause, the faint hum within her steadied further, aligning with her heartbeat, grounding her in a way that felt both new and deeply familiar. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, clear, and she said that it did not feel like power, it did not feel like control, it felt like recognition, like something that had been waiting, not for her to claim it, but for her to notice it. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, and the second elder's gaze sharpened, not with doubt, but with interest, as if he had been listening for something specific and had just heard it. Victor shifted slightly then, not away, but to the side, his stance adjusting as if to reassert his presence within a moment that was continuing to expand beyond him. And when he spoke again, his voice was measured, controlled, reminding the room that recognition alone did not determine leadership. That structure required more than instinct, more than ancient response. But even as he spoke, the argument felt incomplete, as if it were addressing only part of what had happened while ignoring the rest. Seraphine remained still behind him, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet vigilance, her eyes no longer scanning the crowd, but fixed on Elena, watching with an intensity that bordered on disbelief, as if trying to reconcile the woman she thought she understood with the one now standing before her. Elena felt that gaze, but it did not pull at her, did not unsettle her, because the foundation beneath her had already shifted beyond the reach of comparison. The hum within her pulsed once more, subtle but distinct, and for a brief moment, the faintest trace of light flickered again along the carved lines at the base of the throne, drawing a collective breath from those closest to it. And the second elder noticed, his attention snapping toward it before returning to Elena, his expression now carrying something deeper than curiosity, something closer to recognition. He inclined his head slightly, more pronounced than the first elder had done, and though it was not a full gesture of submission, it carried significance, a quiet acknowledgement that rippled outward, altering the posture of those who followed his lead without even realizing it. Victor saw it, felt it, and for the first time, the control he had maintained so carefully showed a fracture, not in action, but in hesitation, a pause that stretched just long enough to be noticed, and in that pause, the balance shifted again, further than before. Elena did not move to fill the space, did not speak to claim what was being offered. She simply stood, allowing the moment to unfold around her, and that restraint became its own form of presence, its own quiet authority. The hall remained still, but it was no longer the stillness of uncertainty. It was the stillness of something taking shape, something not yet fully defined, but already undeniable. And as Elena held her ground, meeting the weight of every gaze without lowering her own, it became clear that whatever this was, whatever had begun beneath her hand and answered through stone, it was not fading. It was only just beginning to reveal itself. The air in the hall had changed so completely that even breathing felt different, as if every inhale carried weight now, not heavy, but deliberate, like the room itself was paying attention to each movement, each choice, and Elena stood at the center of it, not because she had claimed that place, but because everything around her had shifted to meet her there. The second elder's slight bow had not gone unnoticed, and though it was not echoed openly by the others, something quieter began to unfold, a soft realignment of posture, of attention, of instinct, subtle enough that no one could point to a single moment where it happened, but undeniable once it had settled. Victor Hale remained where he was, his presence still strong, still commanding in form, but the certainty behind it had thinned, stretched across a moment that refused to resolve in his favor, and for the first time since he had stepped into power, he found himself standing inside a silence he could not control. Elena could see it now, not in his expression alone, but in the way the space between them no longer belonged to him, no longer responded to his voice as the defining force, and that realization did not come with triumph. It came with clarity, a steady understanding that this was not about replacing one authority with another, but about something deeper shifting beneath all of it. The hum within her remained constant, not louder, not weaker, simply present, and with it came a growing awareness that she did not need to push this moment forward. It was unfolding on its own, guided by something that had already chosen its direction. Seraphine stood just behind Victor, her silence now complete, her earlier attempts to shape the moment gone, replaced by a watchfulness that carried both disbelief and something sharper, something closer to recognition that whatever had just begun was not something she could stand against directly. The elders watched closely, their attention unwavering, and among them, a third voice spoke, not louder than the others, but timed with precision, cutting through the quiet without breaking it, asking whether the throne had ever responded to anyone in this way without a claim, without a ritual, without acknowledgement from the pack itself. The question hung in the air, not directed at Elena alone, but at the entire room, and no immediate answer came. Because the truth of it was already known to those who understood the weight of the throne's history. Elena felt the question settle, felt the attention it drew, and she did not rush to answer, because the answer was not something she could construct. It was something that had already been revealed. Instead, she turned her head slightly, her gaze returning to the throne once more, and in that quiet glance, the faintest flicker of light traced along its base again, subtle but unmistakable, as if acknowledging her awareness, as if confirming that this connection did not require words to exist. A soft murmur moved through the elders, quickly stilled, but not before it carried the first clear thread of something new, something that had not been present at the beginning of this moment, something that resembled acceptance. Victor heard it, felt it, and the shift in his stance was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a recalibration, a recognition that whatever argument he made now would not simply restore the room. It would have to confront what had already been acknowledged, and that realization held him in a rare stillness. Elena turned her gaze back to him, steady and calm, and for a moment the two of them stood in a space that no longer reflected their past roles, no longer defined by dominance and submission, but by something far more uncertain, far more significant. She did not speak. Immediately, allowing the silence to hold, to settle, to make room for what needed to be understood without forcing it into shape. And when she finally did, her voice remained even, grounded, as she said that she had never been taught how to answer the throne, that no one had prepared her for this. But that did not change what had happened, and it did not change what everyone in this room had seen. The words did not challenge, did not accuse. They simply stated what could not be undone, and in doing so, they left no room for dismissal, no path back to the certainty that had existed before. The third elder inclined his head slightly, not as a gesture of submission, but as acknowledgement of truth, and that small motion carried through the group, not replicated exactly, but reflected in the way their attention settled more firmly on her, no longer questioning whether she was part of this moment, but how this moment would redefine what came next. Seraphine's breath left her in a quiet exhale, her composure holding, but thinner now, stretched across a reality that no longer aligned with her expectations, and she did not step forward again, did not attempt to speak, because there was nothing left to shape, only something to witness. Victor remained silent, his gaze locked on Elena, and for the first time, there was no immediate answer in his expression, no ready command, only calculation, careful and deliberate, as if he was beginning to understand that whatever stood before him was not something he could simply move aside. Elena felt that realization settle into the room, not as a single moment, but as a gradual shift, a quiet acceptance that spread through the space like a tide, slow but unstoppable, and as it did, the foundation beneath everything they had known adjusted with it. She stood there, steady, grounded, not claiming anything beyond what had already been shown, and in that stillness, it became clear that this was no longer a question of whether something had changed, but how far that change would go, and whether those standing in this hall would follow it or resist it, knowing that either way, nothing would return to what it had been before. The silence did not shatter when the great doors opened. It deepened, as if the hall itself recognized the weight of what had just arrived before anyone dared to turn, and Elena felt it before she saw him. A presence that moved through the space like a shift in gravity, steady, controlled, undeniable. The elders straightened almost instinctively, not out of fear, but out of recognition. And even Victor Hale's focus flickered for the first time, his attention pulled toward the entrance as the sound of measured footsteps echoed across the stone, each step precise, unhurried, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. Elena turned her head slowly, her gaze lifting toward the doorway, and there he stood, Lucian Blackthorn, the Alpha King, framed by shadow and torchlight, his silver eyes sweeping the room with a calm that cut through the tension like a blade through still water. He did not rush forward, did not raise his voice, he simply walked, and the path before him cleared without command, without question, as if the hall itself understood where he needed to be. The energy in the room shifted again, but this time it did not pull away from Elena. It aligned, threading itself between her and the approaching king in a way that made something inside her chest tighten, not with fear, but with recognition that mirrored the quiet hum still resting beneath her skin. Victor stepped slightly to the side, not fully yielding, but adjusting, creating space where none had existed before, and that movement did not go unnoticed, not by the elders, not by the court, and certainly not by Elena. Lucian's gaze moved across the hall, taking in the throne, the elders, Victor, Seraphine, and finally, Elena, and when his eyes settled on her, they did not flicker, did not question. They held, steady and certain, as if he had already been expecting to find her there. The silence stretched, thick and unbroken, as he came to a stop just a few feet away, close enough that the distance between them felt intentional rather than imposed. And for a moment, no one spoke, because whatever this was, it did not belong to words yet. Elena felt the hum within her shift, not stronger, not weaker, but clearer, as if something that had been waiting now recognized its counterpart. And for the first time since the throne had moved, the presence within her did not feel solitary. It felt answered. Lucian inclined his head slightly, not to the elders, not to Victor, but to her. The motion subtle but unmistakable, and that single gesture sent a ripple through the entire hall, because it did not follow any rule they knew. It did not align with any structure they had been taught. It simply acknowledged something that had already been revealed. Victor's expression tightened, the first true crack in his composure, not explosive, not outward, but controlled tension that could no longer be hidden beneath certainty. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command again, but now it was directed, questioning, asking the Alpha King what he made of this, of what had just occurred, as if seeking validation, or perhaps containment. Lucian did not answer immediately, his gaze still on Elena, and in that pause, the hall seemed to hold its breath again, waiting, measuring, understanding that whatever he said next would not simply interpret the moment, it would define it. Elena met his gaze without lowering hers, without stepping back, and in that exchange, something passed between them, not spoken, not visible, but undeniable, a recognition that did not need explanation, because it existed beyond it. The throne behind them remained still, but the faintest trace of light flickered once more along its base, subtle yet perfectly timed, as if responding not just to Elena now, but to the connection forming in front of it. Lucian finally spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying through the hall without effort, and he said that the throne had not moved in error, that it did not answer to titles, nor to claims, but to truth, and that truth had already revealed itself. The words settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, because they did not challenge the moment, they confirmed it, and in doing so, they shifted the balance completely. Victor did not respond immediately, his gaze moving between Lucian and Elena, calculating, adjusting, but the ground beneath him had already changed, and he could feel it. Seraphine remained silent, her earlier certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something that understood this was no longer a moment she could shape. The elders stood still, but their attention had fully aligned now, no longer divided, no longer uncertain, because the acknowledgement had come from the one authority none of them could question. Elena felt the shift settle, not as something overwhelming, but as something grounding, something that had been moving toward this point from the moment her hand had touched the stone, and now, standing in front of Lucian, with the throne behind them and the court watching, it became clear that what had begun as a moment of humiliation had transformed into something else entirely, something no one in this hall had been prepared for, and yet, something they could no longer deny. Lucian Blackthorne did not move closer immediately, and that restraint carried more weight than any command he could have given, because it made space for the moment to exist fully, unforced, undeniable, and Elena felt that space like a breath held between them, steady and unbroken. His eyes remained on hers, silver and unwavering, not searching now, not questioning, but recognizing. And that recognition settled into her chest with a quiet certainty that mirrored the presence she had felt since the throne first answered her. The hall stood still around them, every person aware that something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone or ignored, and yet no one dared to interrupt it, because whatever this was, it belonged to something beyond their usual rules. Victor Hale's voice broke the silence at last, controlled but edged, asking whether this recognition meant anything beyond the moment, whether it was enough to overturn structure, to challenge what had already been declared. And though his words were measured, there was tension beneath them, a need for clarity that had not existed before. Lucian did not turn to him immediately, did not allow the question to redirect the center of the moment. Instead, he continued to hold Elena's gaze for one more breath, as if confirming something only the two of them could feel, and then, slowly, he shifted his attention, not fully away from her, but enough to include the rest of the room. When he spoke, his voice was calm, grounded, carrying without effort, and he said that what had happened did not overturn structure, it revealed it. That power had always been defined by what the throne recognized, not by what was claimed in front of it, and that distinction settled into the hall like a truth that had been forgotten rather than created. The elders reacted first, not with movement, but with stillness that deepened, their attention sharpening, their understanding aligning with the weight of his words. Because they knew the history, they understood the significance of what had just been spoken, and in that understanding, something old began to reawaken alongside what was new. Seraphine remained silent, her earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet awareness that whatever place she had stepped into moments ago was no longer secure, not in the way she had believed. And though she did not step back, she did not step forward either, held in a space where certainty had been replaced by observation. Victor's posture remained strong, but the tension within it had changed, no longer pushing outward, but pulling inward, recalibrating, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less command and more calculation, asking what this meant for the present, for the decisions already made, for the roles already assigned. Lucian's gaze returned to Elena briefly before answering, and that glance did not go unnoticed, not by Victor, not by the elders, not by anyone watching, because it carried weight, intention, and something else that had not yet been named. He said that the present had already been altered, that what had been decided before this moment did not hold the same authority now, because the foundation beneath it had shifted, and that ignoring that shift would not restore balance, it would fracture it further. Elena listened, her breath steady, her posture grounded, and for the first time since this began, she felt not just recognized, but placed, not in a role she had been given, but in something that had chosen her without her asking. The hum within her aligned with his presence, not overwhelming, not consuming, but steady, like two currents moving in the same direction without colliding, and that alignment brought with it a clarity she had not expected, a sense that this moment was not an ending, but a beginning that extended far beyond this hall. One of the elders stepped forward again, closer than before, and this time, he did not hesitate, his head inclining more fully, not deeply, but with intention, and though it was not a formal declaration, it carried the weight of acknowledgement that could not be dismissed, and that gesture rippled outward, subtle but undeniable, shifting the posture of those who followed his lead. Victor saw it, and for the first time, he did not immediately counter, because the moment had moved beyond argument, beyond simple assertion of authority, and into something that required acceptance or resistance, with no space left for denial. Elena remained still through it all, not stepping forward, not claiming what was being offered, but allowing it to unfold, and in that stillness, she held the center of the room without effort, without force, simply by being present in a way she had never been allowed to before. Lucian took a step closer then, closing the distance slightly, not enough to invade her space, but enough to stand beside her rather than across from her. And that positioning did not go unnoticed, because it redefined the alignment of the moment without a single word. The throne behind them remained silent, but its earlier movement echoed in every mind, reinforcing what had already been acknowledged. And as the hall stood suspended in that quiet, it became clear that whatever came next would not be decided by who spoke the loudest, but by who was willing to accept what had already been revealed. And in that realization, the balance of everything they had known shifted once more, deeper, more permanent, and impossible to ignore. The shift did not need to be announced. It settled into the room like something that had always been waiting to be recognized, and Elena felt it in the way no one spoke over Lucian's last words, no one rushed to challenge them, because the truth in them had already been witnessed, already accepted in silence before it was ever spoken aloud. She stood beside him now, not behind, not beneath, and the difference in that positioning echoed louder than any declaration, because it redefined the space itself, the center no longer belonging to a single voice, but to something shared, something aligned. Victor Hale remained still, his gaze fixed on them, not with open defiance, not with submission, but with a tension that came from understanding exactly what had changed and knowing that it could not simply be undone, and that understanding held him in place more firmly than any command could have. The elders watched closely, their expressions no longer guarded, no longer uncertain, but settled into a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken to be real. And among them, the first elder stepped forward once more, his movement deliberate, his posture steady, and when he stopped within the circle of open space, he inclined his head again, deeper this time, not fully lowered, but enough that no one could mistake the meaning behind it. The gesture did not ripple outward immediately, but it did not need to, because its weight was understood, and one by one, subtly, almost imperceptibly, others followed, not in full imitation, but in small shifts of posture, of attention, of presence that aligned with what had already been recognized. Elena felt it, not as validation, but as confirmation of something she had already accepted within herself, something that no longer required permission to exist. The hum within her remained steady, calm, no longer surging, no longer demanding attention, simply present, like a foundation she had stepped onto without realizing it had always been there. Seraphine stood unmoving now, her earlier composure replaced by a stillness that held both awareness and restraint. And though she did not lower her gaze, she did not attempt to reclaim the moment either, because it had moved beyond her reach, beyond anything she could shape or redirect. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less force, not weakened, but altered, shaped by the recognition that he was no longer speaking from an unquestioned position, but from within a balance that had shifted around him. He said that acknowledgement alone did not determine what came next, that decisions still needed to be made, that structure required clarity, and though his words were logical, necessary even, they no longer held the power to define the moment, only to respond to it. Lucian did not interrupt him, did not dismiss him, and that restraint carried its own authority, because it showed that control did not need to be asserted to be present. When Victor finished, Lucian's gaze moved briefly across the elders, acknowledging them, before returning to Elena, and in that glance, there was a quiet question, not spoken, not demanded, but offered, as if what came next was not his to decide alone. Elena felt it immediately, the shift in responsibility, the opening of space where her voice now mattered, not as something tolerated, but as something necessary, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel it fully, not as pressure, but as possibility. She drew in a slow breath, grounding herself, and when she spoke, her voice remained steady, clear, carrying through the hall without strain, and she said that what had happened did not erase what came before, but it did change what came after, and that ignoring it would not restore balance. It would only delay what had already begun. The words settled into the room with quiet certainty, not challenging, not demanding, but undeniable in their simplicity, and as they did, something shifted again, not in the throne, not in the structure of the hall, but in the people within it, a subtle alignment of understanding that moved through them like a current. The second elder inclined his head slightly in agreement, his posture reflecting the weight of her words, and though he did not speak, his acknowledgement carried as much influence as any statement could have. Victor remained silent, his gaze moving between Elena and Lucian, calculating, adjusting, but the urgency that had driven him earlier had softened, replaced by something more measured, more aware of the ground beneath him. Seraphine's shoulders relaxed slightly, not in surrender, but in recognition, her attention no longer searching for control, but for understanding, and that shift, though small, marked a change in her as well. Elena stood in that space, steady, grounded, aware of every eye on her, and yet untouched by the weight of it, because the source of what had changed did not come from them. It came from something far older, something that had already made its choice. Lucian took another step forward, not ahead of her, but beside her, aligning himself fully now, and that alignment did not need explanation. It spoke for itself, reinforcing what had already been acknowledged. The throne behind them remained silent, but its presence filled the hall, a constant reminder of the moment that had begun all of this. And as the silence settled once more, deeper and more certain than before, it became clear that this was no longer a question of whether the balance had shifted, but how they would move forward within it, knowing that whatever path they chose, it would be built on the truth that had already been revealed, and that truth was no longer something that could be denied. Lucian Blackthorn stood beside Elena, the space between them no longer defined by titles, by power, or by any expectation that had been set before this moment, but by something more fundamental, something that no longer required explanation, only acceptance. The air in the hall felt heavier now, but not with tension, with possibility, like the first breath of a storm that had not yet fully formed, but was undeniably coming, and all those present could feel it, even if they did not fully understand what it meant. The elders remained quiet, their attention not divided, not questioning, but focused, steady, and though no one spoke, the unspoken understanding in the room was palpable, because the foundation of everything they had known had shifted, and now the question was not whether they could change with it, but whether they would. Victor Hale stood at the edge of this moment, not fully part of it, not fully apart, caught in the space where the future was unfolding and the past was slipping away, and Elena could feel that uncertainty in him, could see the way his posture remained strong but no longer as certain, as if he had spent his entire life moving forward with the assumption that things would always be in his control, and now, for the first time, he could not claim that certainty. The stillness in the room did not break, it held, and as time passed in silence, the weight of what had already been acknowledged settled deeper, not just in the minds of the elders, but in the heart of the court itself, and for the first time, Elena realized that she was not simply standing beside Lucian Blackthorn, the Alpha King. She was standing with him, and that was not a position anyone could take away from her, not through force, not through words, not through laws, because it was not hers to give or to lose. It was something that had been established long before she ever realized it had begun. Lucian's gaze remained steady, his presence calm, and though he did not speak, his silence was not the same as it had been earlier. It was full now, filled with understanding, with intention, and when he finally moved, it was not to claim anything, but to shift the focus, to return it to the throne behind them, the silent witness to everything that had passed and everything that would follow. The throne had not moved again, but its presence remained constant, its acknowledgement still clear, and Elena knew then that the truth of what had happened was not just about the moment itself. It was about what had been revealed in the space between the throne and herself, in the way the room had responded to the change, to the recognition, and to the quiet power that had settled into place without anyone needing to declare it. Victor took a step forward then, not toward Lucian, not toward Elena, but toward the throne, and his movement was slow, deliberate, as if he had made a decision, as if he had finally come to terms with what he had been resisting. And when he stood before the throne, his posture shifted again, no longer as a ruler asserting command, but as someone seeking to understand, to acknowledge something that had always been present but had never been fully accepted. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and in that silence, Elena felt the tension dissipate, not in the way it would have if a decision had been forced, but in the way it would if a truth had been allowed to breathe, to live, to exist without resistance. When Victor finally looked up, his gaze met Lucian's, then Elena's, and in that look, there was no challenge, no question, only the quiet recognition of what had shifted, of what could no longer be ignored, and for the first time, Elena saw him not as an adversary, not as someone standing in opposition, but as someone caught in the same moment, watching it unfold just as she was. The court did not move immediately, but the understanding had spread, and when the first elder spoke, his voice carried the weight of history, of tradition, but it did not demand compliance. It simply offered acceptance, and with it, the hall seemed to exhale, to breathe freely for the first time in a long while, as if a door that had been closed for years had finally been opened, and whatever came through it would not be held back. Lucian nodded slightly in response, and his next words were not declarations, not commands, but invitations, soft yet firm, and they offered a path forward, not one of conflict, not one of dominance, but one of collaboration, of understanding, and in that offer, Elena saw the potential for something more, something that had always been there, but had never fully been realized. and she knew then that whatever happened next would not be decided by force or by decree, but by how they chose to move forward together, as a unit, as a group, no longer divided by what they had been, but unified by what they could become.